Hello to our audience in Mexico and those joining us from Europe. I'm Érika Ruiz Sandoval, and I welcome you to the 5th online edition of the EU-Mexico Think Tank Dialogue Initiative. Today we will be talking about a very, very important topic, which is the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis for privacy and individual liberties all over the world, but most importantly in the European Union and in Mexico. As you all know, because I guess most of us are in lockdown and some in strict lockdown, governments have taken extreme measures, at least I've never seen them in my lifetime, of having people stay at home. And for many, that means that fundamental freedoms, privacy protections, and access to justice have been curtailed for the sake of public safety. Some governments have been able to provide some kind of legal justifications and others haven't. For example, military forces have been used all over the world, from Asia to Latin America, to ensure that citizens stay at home. Also, governments have disclosed personal health data of their peoples and have implemented surveillance and phone tracking measures that limit freedom of movement, just for the sake of tracking the development of COVID-19. However, all these apps have also raised several legal concerns related to privacy regulations that were already in place. So for all these reasons, COVID-19 has triggered some urgent questions on digital and civil rights. Civil society and courts all over the world are scrutinizing the measures imposed to contain the spread of the virus. And that go from online tracking, the use of military force, as I said, and biosurveillance. What worries most about this is the fact that once in place, these measures will be hard to get rid of. So that's basically the topic we're going to cover today. And to better understand what are the main impacts this health crisis has brought to both the European Union and Mexico in terms of democracy and especially of privacy and individual liberties, we will talk with Andreas Aktoudianakis, policy analyst at the European Policy Center, working within the Europe's Political Economy Program, who covers the policy areas of the EU Digital Agenda, New Technologies, and Industry 4.0. Gloria González Fuster, research professor at the Vrije Universiteit, Brussels, Faculty of Law and Criminology, co-director of the Law, Science, Technology, and Society Research Group, and member of the Brussels Privacy Hub. She investigates legal issues related to privacy, personal data, protection, and security. María de Jesús Medina Arellano is a full-time researcher at the Legal Research Institute of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. She has focused her research on health law, bioethics, and regulation of emerging technologies. And Andrea Mendoza Enríquez, who's professor researcher of the Division of Legal Studies at the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, CIDE. Andrea Mendoza specializes in law and technology, specifically in the area of regulation. Thank you all in advance for sharing your thoughts and your expertise with us. As the conversation moves along, all the attendees, please feel free to post your questions on the online chat of the webinar. All participants can see them, and at the end, we'll select a few of them for them to answer. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your question, but the time is limited. The first question goes to Gloria. Could you give us a brief overview of why fundamental rights are more important than ever in the midst of the outbreak of COVID-19, and what are the competences of the European Union to guarantee them? You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I will try to explain why fundamental rights are important now and what's the role of the European Union in 5 minutes. And it helps that I normally tend to speak too fast, so perhaps there's a hope that I will say something useful, I don't know. But first, why are fundamental rights important in general? Are they important now? Yes, this is why we create fundamental rights, because we know there will be moments of crisis. There will be moments where things are difficult, also for democracies, and this is why we have a series of rights that we place above everything else. So we know that politicians sometimes have the temptation to have creative ideas with legislation to take measures because they feel some pressure. So we know some rights have values are above all this and have to be kept there somewhere. This is in general, all countries know this, and for the European Union, it's also the case, and not everybody knows this, and so I think it's important to mention this. So people think fundamental rights are important for the constitutions of countries. Maybe they are important at a universal level for the United Nations. Some people know the Council of Europe has a mandate to protect human rights, but actually the European Union also has obligations and commitment to fundamental rights, and it is committed to accede one day to the European Convention of Human Rights, and now it has had for a number of years its own list of fundamental rights. So the list of the rights that the European Union thinks are the most important, that's the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And I don't know if the audience has read the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Not everybody in Europe has read this charter, so perhaps not everybody in Mexico. I have read the charter, and there is an article that I read very, very often in this charter, and it's Article 8 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. What is this article? It's the article saying that we all have a fundamental right to the protection of personal data. It's really my favorite right, and I read it very often, and every time I read this right, I think, well, this right is very important, and every day it seems to me more important. And I'm very glad to hear that in Mexico, you also have a similar right. You have a constitutionally protected right to the protection of personal data. I think it's Article 16 of your constitution. And I think it's very important that we have this right now. And I think you have it since 2009. That's just like the European Union. And it's important in general, but we know that now with this crisis, we are seeing a number of reasons why it is indeed even more important now in this crisis. So coming to your question specifically, why is it important now in this crisis? And I think it's basically three points. One is just because data is so important in our life for all of us. I think you mentioned you are in lockdown, we are in lockdown. All our lives are now basically data, digital. We communicate here through this platform, Zoom, which is an American company doing something with our data. What do they do? I think it's very important that we know what happens to our data when we communicate, when we teach, when we work, when we play, when we communicate with our families. Data is everywhere, so we are all the time just doing things with data. It's very important that all this data are safeguarded somehow. So data protection is very, very important. It's important that we have a fundamental right, but it's also very important, of course, that data protection is enforced and it's a reality. And that's something that we are still trying to make it a reality at some point. The second point, why is data protection very important now, especially from a European perspective? Also because now we realize that scientific research and scientific research involving health is very, very important. There is a massive effort of people, researchers, trying to come up with solutions very quickly, collaborating with them. And the only way to do this is if they have data protection safeguards, if they apply some safeguards that they enable them to do this collaboration efficiently. And for me, this is one of the things, the aspects in which the European Union could do much better. We have a regulation, the GDPR, that harmonizes many things, but failed to harmonize this question of scientific research, the use of health data. We know that the European Data Protection Board, which is a body that is following this up, responsible for this, they are aware of the problem, but I think we could do much more to actually facilitate this international collaboration for scientific research. The very last point why I think data protection is more important now than ever, and this fundamental right, is really because of this creativity of national legislators, of even the European legislator eventually, to come up with new solutions to fight the virus, the spread of the virus. And I think creativity is good, but it can have some funny implications for data. And we see that there is a lot of creativity with technological solutions. So I don't know if you have seen this, but here in Europe, if you have ever invented a gadget, now you can repurpose your gadget for COVID-19 purposes. So you invented a bracelet that we used to measure temperature for women who wanted to be pregnant. Now you say, well, I can also use it for fighting the spread of COVID-19. You invented a drone. Well, I can use the drone to see if people are doing a picnic. I can use whatever. And we know people like to use data, artificial intelligence. The European Union has been trying to support that people embrace artificial intelligence, that we all share data. And now there's a thinking, how can we share data, use data for the fight against COVID-19? So when we are getting creative, we have to remember there is this right, you can do this, but just placing some data protection safeguards. And then there's, in this context, this whole discussion about contact tracing apps.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody has a question, we can think, what is the role there of the national authorities? What is the role there of the European Commission? The European Commission is taking a role in this discussion. So, but I know we have limited time for this opening introduction, but just happy to continue later.
Fantastic, thank you, Gloria. Andrea, how can governments protect public health and uphold people's basic rights and liberties at the same time? What is the right balance? Could you please provide some examples from the Mexican case, which is the one you know best? You have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. It's important to discuss these topics from international visions and agreements from the countries. First, I have to say that Mexico was accepted in 2018 Convention 180, the Council of Europe on the processing of personal data. That information is important because we have to compliance with the European vision from legal data protection. This fact commits the country to protect the personal data in terms of European visions. Our legislation is in accordance with the Convention of 108 of the Council of Europe. However, the speed of the COVID-19 pandemic brings challenges about the correct balance between, for example, the right to health, the right to life, or the privacy right or data protection right. So I think the main challenges are in issues such as information security, interoperability between electronic platforms in health. For example, in Mexico, there is a unique electronic file in the public sector, but it's difficult to achieve communications between the public and private health sectors. Thinking that today the Mexican government has agreements to share capacities for patient care between public and private sector and training on data protection issues for data controllers. So there is as Gloria says, there is a constitutional regime of exception to the right to protection of personal data that includes public health reasons. For example, in the case of consent to process data, but it should be understood as something extraordinary, which will be justified in times of pandemic, but that the treatment of the data don't lose the principles inherent to the right to protection of personal data, such the proportionality or purpose, the final purpose. I think that we are facing an undetected opportunity to preserve human dignity in the digital age. I think that public sector have to enforce the law, the compliance, and the opportunity to treat those personal data considering the humanity dignity as the base of everything. We have some examples in Mexico of requests from collaborations between some companies and the city government, Ciudad de Mexico government, to share information about about where are the mobile electronic disposed. But I think that the key is the information in general, anonymizing, not with the personal data of each user. I mean, technology brings the opportunity to fight against COVID-19, but technology, I don't know, with the dignity, with the human dignity on the base. So these kind of collaborations are good. For example, the government gave some information about how many people are staying at home, but that information can be possible only with the collaboration between private corporations and government, but with the limit that respect human rights, in this case, privacy and data protection rights. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you both for giving us this initial perspective. Now we'll go to María de Jesús. Could you explain further what is the legal framework in Mexico amidst current health contingency? Could you share your thoughts on the main bioethical concerns that are at stake in terms of liberties and safety in this crisis?
Absolutely.
For example, given the government surveillance measures and vaccine enforcement policies. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, María Jesús.
Thank you, Érika, and thank you to all my colleagues and all the audience that is just here with us. I must start saying that on March 29, the General Council of the Sanitary Authority declared the sanitary emergency. So that is very important to frame what is going on afterwards and what is the legal framework that all the measures have been based on, which is part of these extraordinary powers that the authority has in terms of an emergency, sanitary emergencies. So there is no restriction to our liberties or rights, but there are some restrictions that we have to take into account in terms of mitigating what is going on with COVID-19 in Mexico. I think that is very important. Well, that is the first question about the legal structure, the framework. And the next one regarding the bioethical issues, that is my specialty that I would like to focus on. And it's important to have in mind the structural violence against women that is normalized in our country, to highlight what are the values at stake. That is why also gender perspective should be included in any policy or any analysis about the issues in legal and ethical terms, in order to find out solutions that not reproduce or exacerbate inequalities that we are already facing in normal times. During this pandemic, a lot of significant ethical and social issues have been raised, spanning from the preparations before the first confirmed case to the implementation of measures to contain. Some of the most pressing issues are the extent of the restrictive measures, the reciprocal duties to healthcare workers, the allocation of scarce resources, and the need for research in order to find out vaccines, and then the implementation and access to the vaccination. I think that to analyze in terms of obligatory vaccination, at least in Mexico, shouldn't be the main issue. I think that we should be focusing on the access to the vaccination, to the equal access first. However, while policy and ethical frameworks are being developed to face these problems, I think that as a casualty, or I don't think that is intentional, is still the gender perspective is missed. Understanding our realities is essential to truly tackle all of these problems in the pandemic. We believe that this is because of our traditional approaches tend to be abstract and based on universal absolutes, which are not real or in accordance to reality. They tend to focus on individualistic principles and rights of privacy in individualistic terms. And I think that we are ignoring other ethical principles like solidarity, compassion, and communitarian values, which are essential to tackle all of these questions that we have already discussed, that Gloria mentioned it, and Andrea as well. And I think that from the bioethical part, I think that we have to tackle the issues just getting apart from individual principles such as autonomy and more in communitarian ethical principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, María de Jesús. Now, despite it all, the COVID-19 outbreak has some silver linings, if we want to think about that. It has accelerated the transition to digitalization. In a couple of weeks, various working places, academic institutions, and bureaucracies became fully digital, which we thought that was not possible before, and now we can do it. So, Andreas, what lessons do you see industries can extract from this massive global experiment, and how should these be balanced with the respect of individual liberties and privacy? You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Érika. Hello, everyone, and thank you for offering me this place to speak here today with you. It's been great listening to the previous speakers and really interesting, and I hope this is exciting for your listeners too. So as you said, yes, ever since the COVID-19 crisis broke out, we have seen major developments and acceleration in policy trends and discussions that we hadn't seen much happening over the past. So it is true in a way that the COVID-19 crisis puts us at a war footing in a way. And when economies and states are in this situation, it is expected of them to act really quickly. The same applies here to the industries and the private companies that are working in our societies. And I'm going to speak specifically here about the tech giants and the platforms such as Facebook, the platforms that we all know so well, and how they have adapted to this new reality in the last couple of weeks, in the last couple of months, excuse me. So we see that until now, we have been criticizing these companies for their lack of responsibility in addressing privacy concerns, and their lack of responsibility in moderating the kind of information that is shared online on their networks. Now, in these last couple of weeks, this has changed completely. We see that these platforms are now actually in some cases in better position than governments to track the spread of the virus. By having access to this enormous amount of data that is communicated on Facebook, then these companies, for example, Facebook or others, they can they have a very good idea about what is happening and where. Now, before states and other sectors start thinking about taking the solutions that these tech companies provide to track the virus and its spread, especially for the recovery period that's going to follow later, we'll have to think very carefully about where does this take us? Where does this trend, the trend of data sharing communities such as Facebook, to have access to this kind of information and also to be able to shape government responses? We'll have to be very careful about that, because in such a short amount of time, we are talking about accelerating discussions about giving access to our data. We're thinking about accelerating these so much faster than ever before. And doing anything hasty at this point will set an important precedent for the time to come. It's easy now to think about easy and fast solutions, but it's going to be more difficult later to address problems that we didn't think about at this time. So at this point, what would be the most important approach and the most important lesson to draw is that we shouldn't wait until an extreme case, an extreme crisis breaks out. We need to think about these things in advance, and perhaps the biggest lesson we take out of this is that until now we have had this data resting with companies and social media networks. It is time that we think more carefully about who has access to this data and how should we make it available in ways that does not violate human rights and privacy rights, but at the same time, in a way that we can draw conclusions about our activities and about how to make our social living experience better, especially in times of crisis like this. And there is a lot that the EU can suggest here, and there's a lot that has happened already, but there's also a lot to look forward to, and we need to think about this carefully, as I said, to avoid setting a bad precedent that will make our work a lot more difficult later for us and for our citizens.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Now, I'm going to ask questions to all four of you. I think what we have seen are tensions between, yes, privacy on the one hand, but also safety and security and health on the other. We are seeing tensions between the private sector and these platforms that Andreas just mentioned, and the governments, which have basically revealed themselves as unable to handle the crisis on their own. We're also talking about a dependency from us individuals from technology. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't be able to have this webinar or work or communicate with our families, etc. We're dependent, and therefore once you're dependent, you're willing to forgo perhaps your rights or don't know even that you have some rights. As Gloria was saying, maybe we haven't read the charters or the constitutions or the legislation in terms of what is legal for companies and governments to do with our information. And perhaps part of the problem with COVID-19 is that we're all panicking. And in panic, I guess societies tend to be more willing to forgo all regulation, etc., as long as they stay safe. Now, we're talking about two important actors here, the European Union and Mexico. We just, last week, it was announced that we concluded the modernization of our global agreement. So how can we both cooperate in guaranteeing privacy and individual liberties once we get over COVID-19 and go back to our regular lives that are certainly going to be different? What have we learned so far in terms of good practices and lessons to deal with similar threats in the future that you could think of and share with our audience? And what is your prediction in terms of privacy and individual rights for the post-COVID-19 world? Do we need more regulation? Should it be done nationally? Should it be done at the level of the European Union? Should we do it internationally through some kind of big compact among all countries? Is it a collective effort, or should we pay more attention to each individual per se? We're going to start with Gloria. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. I have, I think, some seconds to react to Andreas. So I think he's right in many aspects, but I think it's wrong to say that we realize now that we are so dependent on tech giants, on American tech giants. Europe has realized this for many years. And just before the outbreak, there was a communication on reinforcing a data economy strategy for the European Union to be stronger on data, more assertive on all matters relating to data. That was published just in February. There is an open consultation now. So this is a continuous effort. I think that what is now new is really the role that member states in Europe. So you see we have two actors, Mexico and the European Union. It used to be that more or less that simple, but now the national actors are very more important that nobody ever expected them to be so important, because it's a public health issue. They have some apps, they want to have data that they can access. They have their own agreements with their private companies, and it's getting a bit tricky for the European Union to have this coordinated approach now, because internally it's a bit wild, I would say, even from a data perspective. And even if we have this principle of a free flow of data in the European Union, it's not so clear that we are really keeping this like this. Nevertheless, on an international global perspective, that is still true. The European Union is very much united. And I think what can be done for privacy, I think first is this agreement acknowledging that we need data protection if we want data transfers, and there's only a way out of this, that we have data transfers and exchange of data. Then we need data protection, international global solutions. Andrea mentioned Convention 108, which is it's an instrument which is not of the European Union, but of the Council of Europe. It has been modernized, so Mexico could sign also the modernized version, ratify the modernized version, which is closer to the GDPR that we have in the European Union. But I think Mexico is really interested in global solutions. And the bad thing for Mexico is that actually you were to host the Global Privacy Assembly. So there's a conference of international commissioners and privacy commissioners, and they were supposed to meet in Mexico this year, but because of the crisis, it will be next year. You have more time to prepare a good strategy, so perhaps it's a good thing. But the main message is keep committed to this international discussion, because it's too easy to just say, if just quitting, like for instance Brazil, not to mention them, who said, we have a crisis, we postpone all data protection regulation. That's not going to be useful for getting out of the situation. So that was my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Andrea, your thoughts?
Okay, there are a lot of things to say. First, it's important to talk about peripheral countries. I don't know the meaning about countries that needs technology from other countries, so we don't have enough technical development to fight against COVID. For example, with their own platforms, with own data centers, and the other thing that we have a unique opportunity about open data create from public and private sector to take care of data protection right. So we have to, we could use open data to fight against COVID. And we have the unique opportunity to analyze what happened after, or what happened in the past in Europe. What about the treatment of Jewish information, about the first law with privacy in Universal Human Declaration. So we have to analyze what's important and the right balance between the health of people, but taking care about dignity, because after this, we have the news are there. So people, it will be more difficult to people that has COVID to come to continue their lives, because there is not a correct treatment about our worries about the government. I think that other important thing that in Mexico we have signed the TEMEC, the agreement, the commercial agreement with United States and Canada. So this agreement, it's important because in digital commerce terms are some cooperation about transfers, international transferring data. So we have to compliance with European Vision's agreements, not with another that could be against human dignity. So I'm worried about international vision agreement of the first constitutional rights and European visions against other models of law, like common law, like other recognition, new recognitions about the data right. So I think that government have to be more involved in this and analyze the real impact of a real compliance of European Vision's data protection right.
Thank you very much, Andrea. María de Jesús.
Thank you very much, Gloria and Andrea. I totally agree to what you say, in particular what you say at the end, Gloria, in terms of not postponing any discussion, that even though we are not meeting physically, we need to keep on tackling the issues and finding better ways to discuss how this data sharing collaboration will be preventing the distrust, public distrust, and also stigmatization probably on some communities. I'm talking from my ethical perspective, right? And even though it will be violating some privacy rights, also that violation will perpetuate the stigmatization towards certain communities. So we need to keep focusing on how we are protecting confidentiality and the privacy of all this data sharing that is necessary, but how we are going to do it must be crucial in terms of individual and communitarian rights and ethical values. On the other hand, I totally agree with Andrea that it's very difficult to comply with an trilateral treatment with countries that have not signed the sanitary regulation internationally, the one established by the World Health Organization that focus on human dignity, the respect of human dignity, privacy, transparency, that is in the center of any kind of regulation regarding this pandemic or any pandemic. So we need to just be online to those principles that are also established in our Constitution in Article 1st and are mandatory, are not up to the government to just respect. They have to be signing, reviewing, and participating in any international collaboration, having in mind all human rights as obligatory, established in our constitutions and in the social human rights based on a social perspective. Social justice is important, and it should be at the center of this discussion and shouldn't be postponed, should keep on going, taking into consideration this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, María de Jesús. Andreas.
Yeah, thank you, Érika. First, yeah, let me just respond very quickly back to Gloria. Gloria, yeah, I agree with you completely. But yeah, of course, the European strategy for data has been published, and we are aware about the power of data in shaping policy responses. But I think this has been the first time where we are thinking about using this data so quickly in order to respond on an emerging crisis that broke out. We'll have the chance maybe to talk about this later. But yeah, at this point, you know, I think, you know, it is really important to think about what is going on in our societies and put it into context, especially when it comes to concerns about democracy and what is the kind of society we have in, you know, in a democratic administration kind of framework. So in that case, you know, it's really important to have in mind that during this COVID-19 crisis, different states in Europe, different states in America, in America, yeah, they have entered what we call a state of emergency. And you know, this state of emergency in some places comes at a time when democracy has already started to corrode. And you know, when you apply this kind of measure in a place that has already a few problems, and I'm not referring here to Mexico, I'm thinking about it more generally. But you know, state of emergency is something that gives freedoms to the state to decide some things with greater speed, and the executive has this right. But then there is a big question here about rights, like everybody else has mentioned here, and how do you give back those rights that you took back during the crisis? The EU on this part, with the fundamental rights that we discussed earlier, it has a very strong constitutional basis to say that whatever follows, you know, in policies that deal with managing data, or in policies that, you know, in other areas, these rights have to be respected in every occasion. So this is an important way to defend that. But there is also the kind of agreements that take place at the international stage. And we know that the EU has the power to shape with what we call its conditionality. It has the power to shape policies, and also through free trade agreements. And it has the power to condition certain policy protections in place for citizens. So that's great. But what at the international stage, and now here we're referring probably to the OECD and efforts to tackle data and privacy access online. This is a bigger question. And I think, you know, it will be easy to think about this in the ensuing dialogue that we're going to have, rather than to make up a statement of my own. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now we'll go to the Q&A section. Our audience is posting questions on the chat. The first one is if the current health crisis has given the opportunity for governments to take measures that represent a setback in individual freedoms achieved in decades of democratic struggle. Are we really talking in the world, in the European Union, in Mexico, about a setback for democracy because of COVID-19? Is that the case? Let's go with María de Jesús.
No, I wouldn't say that. I think that we need to keep, I mean, we have achieved our individual liberties, and it's not about setting back or those liberties. It's about thinking in our liberties, in our autonomy, in order to help out the communities. It's and someone just asked further on that which kind of ethical communitarian values, no? If I exercise my liberty, my autonomy in a responsive way, in terms of reciprocity, solidarity, thinking about vulnerable populations, we can just strengthen our individual liberties, but thinking in our global community.
Okay, but I understand. I mean, we need to be more, to have more solidarity, to think about the rest. Part of the reason why we're in lockdown is not only because you don't want to get sick, but you don't want to make others sick. But how does that really work in reality, in the real world? What about Europe, Gloria? Is that the way people are thinking? Is that, or are we seeing democratic setbacks also in Europe?
So I think we are seeing in Europe and some setbacks that were kind of announced before, and I will not just say in that specific country, but there are many things happening. Now we all pretend to we still believe that in a couple of weeks everything will be back to normal, no? So now is the moment of truth. Was this just justified because it's proportionate, because it was for a little moment and then we go back to normality? But indeed, I think it's a moment of a lot of risk. So now here in Belgium, we are starting to go out of the lockdown, and we do hear people on television saying, you might have to give up some of your freedoms, but your freedoms, you have no freedom now because you cannot go out of your house. So maybe it's better that you give up a bit of freedom. It's not worse than what you have now, and it's so crazy because it's not working like this. Indeed, we are now staying at home. It doesn't mean that I give up my freedom. It's a crazy type of reasoning. But I have an interesting reflection following on María de Jesús. Indeed, I think I don't know if people will think about the others, but I think people should. And I want to come back to this question of the contact tracing apps. I don't know if everybody is familiar. So there are many types of these apps. But some of them are more intrusive than others. And so the basic idea is that you keep track of the people you are in contact with. The most privacy preserving will not be, you cannot identify with whom you were in contact with. But I think for me that's so people are being invited in general to download this app. So the idea is that people will be invited to download these apps, collecting data about others for the purpose of preserving society, because it's good for research, it's good for policy making. But I do think that depending on who you meet, it's not only about that you accept to give up your data, you're collecting the data of others. And I go only to selected places, but I go occasionally to the European Parliament, and there are human rights activists, there are people who perhaps must be protected. Who am I to decide that I will keep my data collection on if the app is not safe? Maybe the app is fully safe, then I'm fine. But if the data has a risk for others, perhaps I should not download this app. So this is the kind of practical examples where I think we should indeed see that there is more to this than just our privacy. The privacy of others, it's also individual in a way, but it's not us, it's the others. So there is no real dichotomy between us and fundamental rights and this community thinking, I believe.
Okay, Andreas, we have a question here about what is your view on the Apple and Google alliance to make a Bluetooth-based tracking app? Are we going to give them too much power to Apple and Google?
Well, I think they have. Oh, sorry, you said Andrea.
Andreas, yes. Then we'll go to Andrea.
Okay. Well, I think that these companies have already quite a lot of power, although we didn't decide to give it to them. They took it, and they took it well. They took it with legal, there was nothing wrong with them doing that. But, as their power has grown so much, we now see that these implications are going beyond what started as a small website, in the case of Facebook, Google, Apple. Apple's a different story here because this is more, it's not a platform, but it is true that Apple and Google are working together on this Bluetooth-based tracking application. As much as we don't like it, it is also true that they have excellent know-how in how to put this together and how to make it work and make it efficient. Probably Apple and Google are in a better footing than some public administrations and officials to have an opinion on that about how it is possible. Also because all the devices, most of the devices that we have in our hands and we communicate are made by Apple or somebody else, but they definitely have some software from Google. So we need to think about what is practical here. If we are to actually track this, the spread of this virus and how it works and how people can avoid spreading it further, we really need to go to the solutions that are actually going to work. But the question is, can we have a solution that is safeguarded at the same time with laws, regulations that can give the citizens access to this data, can give the citizens the right to manage this data? And can we make sure that this data is not going to leave your phone and be stored somewhere else? So in that case, the debates as they have been progressing, the most important concern here is to have a decentralized model for such an application. A model where your data is not going to be stored in somebody's hard drive away from your phone. It's going to be stored in your phone. And there's a number of concerns here. And the European Commission has published a guide as to how should mobile tracking applications track you. But in the case of the Apple and Google partnership, and we need to be realistic, as I said, who can do this in the best way possible. But at the same time, we need to be sure that this kind of alliance is not going to give them a competitive advantage in the long term that is going to harm competition and also is going to undermine rights in other areas.
Okay. Andrea, we have a question now, Andrea, the one without the S, Andrea. How could severe surveillance measures from governments and local authorities can be prevented and regularized in order to protect our fundamental privacy rights, mostly in the relaxation of the lockdowns? Which authority, international or domestic, could be the reference to appeal for the protection of civil rights? Are we going to see more regulation after this, Andrea? I mean, do we need more regulation? Have we realized that we haven't done enough and that states can just take away our individual freedoms for the sake of safety?
Okay, thank you. In my opinion, we don't need more regulation because we need to focus to compliance the regulation that is there, that we have now. The example that gave about the agreement trade between United States, that's an example that we are concerned about sign new agreements, but we don't compliance with their with the I don't know, with the European vision rights, for example. I think that collaboration helps too much to get a solution more faster. The collaboration between private sector with public, for example, the information that Google or Facebook has about the users, it's very important to give up public more effective, but we have to consider the constitutional democratic state that give the correct rules between the balance and rights and the activity and the government activities. We have now some rights in constitutional way that contains some exceptional or extraordinary things about, for example, I gave the example in the terms of the consent, the allow another person to realize treatment, but we stop to give citizens all their data protection right between or during the pandemic, but after this, we have to take care about the principles that are the rectory of the data protection right. I don't know. This is an extraordinary situation, so the authority has to be concerned about the compliance. For example, in Mexico, we have our National Authority of Data Protection, so that this is the moment to be concerned about how government treats the healthy data or private. So I think to close this idea, so constitutional democratic state is the solution. We don't need more regulation. We don't need more law. We have a strong law, but we have to comply with the law.
Thank you very much. Another question, this one for Gloria. Do you consider the political disputes seen in some countries hamper the respect of human rights in the present COVID crisis? If yes, how can this be tackled? Are we seeing more political disputes because of COVID?
I was reading this question and I was wondering what do you mean, person who asked the question? Because yes, political dispute is not a crime, no? Political dispute is good. I think it's part of democracy, and it would be a problem if because of the crisis we didn't have political dispute, political disagreement, I think. So, or maybe I'm not understanding the question, but if there is political disagreement, normally what we have seen in Europe, my understanding of the situation is that the days where they were at the highest peak, like the situation was more critical, politicians were relatively calm and did not have disagreements in public that much. And indeed, as this curve goes down slowly, politicians dare to disagree. But I think it's healthy that politicians disagree, and that's not a problem for me.
But what do we do? I mean, we've seen it, especially in Europe, now that you're starting the de-escalation of measures. We've seen that the political debate has ignited again. And many are defending or using as an argument for their political dispute this thing about individual rights and freedoms and freedom of movement, and that it's arbitrary for the party in power to be keeping people locked in. And we've seen it in the United States. We've seen this masses going with their weapons, etc., to the Capitol to demand opening society. How do we find a balance for the sake of health and of life preservation for society as a whole, while the argument that is being used is that of defending private rights or civil liberties like that?
I think as a general rule, limitations of rights and freedoms have to be minimal. And so one of the things that I have seen indeed is, for instance, threats to freedom of expression online. So there was this problem, and there is still this problem. We are fighting misinformation about COVID-19. So we monitor communications much more than before to try to fight against misinformation more than ever. When is misinformation about COVID-19 really misinformation about, or misinformation about the measures? When is criticism a bit too much? There are risks there, and how do you prevent this? Well, you try to indeed make sure that freedom of expression, in general, I would say, let's make sure that we have freedom of expression, even if there will be some misinformation, that's for sure. But there is indeed a thin line in some cases, but yes, but that's not for me political dispute, but it's a bit the opposite of political dispute. That's government trying to bring down political dispute.
Okay, María de Jesús, you talked about the gender perspective. I mean, and it's not only gender, it's other vulnerable groups that will perhaps suffer after, well, are suffering now during the COVID crisis, but will suffer even more after the COVID crisis, especially if their privacy is not respected. You talked about discrimination, you talked about groups being pointed at because they're sick, etc. How do we deal with that from a bioethical perspective and the perspective of rights and of community? How do we take care of ourselves in that sense? María de Jesús.
Thank you, Érika. Well, that's a very tough question. Yeah, we have seen that, for example, you must know that most of the healthcare professionals worldwide are women. And those fighting in the front line, I don't like to say front line because it's a little bit too strong, but we have seen how in Mexico they've been attacked by people by misinformation. And I think that it's really connected about what Gloria said. This political dispute should be open, should be public, and in order to fight and tackle down misinformation. And in that sense, we are going to fight also stigmatization towards the people who are who are facing most risk, like the healthcare professional, and mostly women. And this is not something that I don't have an intuition. It's the World Health Organization that has established 70% of healthcare professionals worldwide are women. And in our country, we have seen the violence against the healthcare professionals who are women. So this panic has also been prompted by the misinformation generated by political leaders. And this is not itself a political dispute. This is political misinformation. I mean, if you see a leader being unresponsible and talking nonsense publicly, that is not political dispute. That is misinformation expressed by a politician. And then we are going to analyze the responsibilities of those politicians that are not trying to generate discussions. They are trying to misinform and generate this panic. This has led, for example, to panic buying, not only for food, but also for drugs. This declaration of politicians saying about some drugs or the infectant that could be helping in fighting this COVID-19, it's very responsible and have led women suffering of chronic diseases like arthritis, lupus, and many other conditions with no drugs to be treated and controlled during this pandemic. So people are not just buying food as a panic attack by the political leaders giving this information. They are also not thinking in communitary terms. They are buying drugs that they may not need, and the people who live with chronic diseases, they are more in risk to just be not controlled because of this misinformation just expressed by political responsibility, not political dispute.
Okay, thank you very much, Andreas. I think it's our last question because we don't have any more time. Andreas, what's your view on organizations, employers asking visitors or employees, both in the EU and Mexico, about recent travel history or medical information? Do we have an obligation to protect or maintain a safe place of work when measures are relaxed? Under which circumstances could that be justified? How are we going to deal with the day after, Andreas?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, there is no easy answer to that. So obviously, it is your right to travel, to move, to associate with other people, but it's also other people's right to feel safe, in their own engagements. And so in that case, we have to find a balance in that case, which is easy to say and more difficult to do. But these are extreme circumstances we're talking about. This is not an average situation here because people are dying. Yeah. So we should, of course, have measures in place that can trace the spread of the virus and protect others from contracting the virus. But how can we do that without violating rights? This is the big question, and I don't think that these are questions that are going to leave us anytime soon. The next day that we are calling it the next day, it's a euphemism for the next year, because there is no such thing as the day after when COVID stopped being around.
Right.
We need to think about this. You know, we are all taking lessons. The society, policymakers, industry, scientists. We are taking lessons about what to do the next time, and this is very much of a rehearsal. In the sense that we haven't seen anything like that before. I mean, at least in our lifetimes. So what we are going to do now is going to very much set the foundations for how we will be dealing with these kinds of crises in the future. Okay. And democratic backsliding here is the biggest concern in the long term, but obviously there are other concerns in the immediate term, and that is about how people are going to survive and how can we go back to work and jumpstart our economies again.
That is right. Thank you so much to all four of you for participating in this conversation. I think the topic is extremely, extremely relevant. That means that we should not only be vigilant about our health and concerned about ourselves and others, but also be vigilant about our rights and also think that, yes, life is the most important value, but life without rights is not basically what we were fighting for in the beginning. Thank you so much to all of you. We'll have another webinar next week, next Tuesday, same time, same place, for yet another interesting issue related to COVID-19 between the European Union and Mexico. Please be safe, and thank you very much for being with us today.